I came home from the hospital on a Wednesday afternoon in a wheelchair because the surgeon had been clear that I would not be walking unassisted for at least 10 days, and possibly longer depending on how the hip responded. It had been a planned surgery, a full hip replacement, the kind they schedule months in advance and prepare you for with leaflets and preoperative appointments and a physiotherapist who shows you weeks before exactly how to get in and out of a car afterward. I had done everything right. I had cleared my work calendar for 6 weeks. I had set up the spare room downstairs as a recovery space because the surgeon had told me more than once that the first 10 days were about stillness, quiet, and not having to navigate stairs. I had set that room up myself 3 weeks before the surgery, on an afternoon when I still had full mobility and could move furniture and arrange things exactly as I wanted them. A single bed with a firm mattress, positioned so I could see the garden through the window. A side table within reach for water, medication, my phone, a book. A small lamp with a warm bulb, because I knew I would be spending long hours awake at strange times, and I didn't want fluorescent light. I had even thought about sound. The spare room shares a wall with the garage, and I had specifically chosen that room over the other downstairs option because the garage was, as far as I knew, simply storage. Boxes, the lawnmower, things that don't make noise. My husband, Robert, wheeled me through the front door and down the hallway toward the spare room. And the first thing I noticed, before I saw anything, before I even reached the doorway, was sound. Music. Not loud, but present, coming through the shared wall in a way that the room had never produced before, because there had never been anything on the other side of that wall capable of making sound. "What's that?" I said. Robert's hands on the wheelchair handles did something. A small hesitation. A half-second of altered grip pressure that I felt rather than saw, because I was facing forward and he was behind me. "Connor's been staying in the garage," he said. "Just temporarily. I'll ask him to keep it down." Connor. Robert's son from his first marriage. 26 years old, between jobs, again, and between living situations, which had been a recurring feature of Connor's adult life since he was 21. I had known Connor for the 6 years Robert and I had been married, and I had a comprehensive, carefully maintained understanding of what staying temporarily meant when applied to Connor, because I had watched the pattern play out at least 4 times before, always at a distance, always in some other space that wasn't directly mine. This was not at a distance. This was 18 inches from the bed I would be lying in for the next 10 days, recovering from major surgery, in the room I had specifically chosen for its quiet. "When did he move into the garage?" I said. "Last week," Robert said, "while you were doing your pre-op stuff. He needed somewhere, and the garage was just sitting there." The garage was not just sitting there. The garage contained, among other things, my late mother's good china in protective boxes, 4 years of tax documents in a filing cabinet, my gardening equipment, and a workbench that Robert used for small household repairs. It was storage, yes, but it was storage with a function. And it was also, I understood in that moment with the particular clarity that sometimes arrives precisely when you are most physically compromised, a space that Robert had apparently surveyed, assessed, and reassigned without mentioning it to me. During the week, I was preoccupied with preoperative appointments and could not reasonably be expected to notice. I did not say anything else in that moment. Robert wheeled me into the spare room and helped me into the bed. And he was gentle and attentive in the particular way he is genuinely good at. Fetching water, adjusting pillows, checking the time for my next dose of medication. And I lay there, freshly operated on, with morphine still working its way out of my system. And I listened to music coming through a wall that had never made sound before. And I thought, I cannot deal with this today. I cannot deal with this week.
but I am not going to forget it. And when I am strong enough to deal with it properly, I am going to deal with it completely.
That first night was difficult, in the way the first night after major surgery is always difficult. Pain that arrives in waves regardless of medication timing. The strange unfamiliarity of your own body. The particular loneliness of being awake at 3 a.m. while the rest of the house sleeps. At around 11, the music through the wall stopped. I was grateful for that. At around midnight, I heard a different sound. A door, the garage's side door, opening and closing, and then footsteps on the gravel path outside the window, and a car door, and an engine, and the car pulling away. At around 1:30, the same sequence in reverse. A car returning, the side door, footsteps, and then faintly, voices. Connor's and someone else's, a woman's. Both of them trying and failing to be quiet. The particular failed quietness of people who have been drinking and think they are being considerate. I lay in the dark, with my hip throbbing, and I listened to two people attempting to whisper on the other side of a wall that was supposed to separate my recovery space from the rest of the world. And I thought about the word temporarily. And I thought about the 4 previous occasions I had watched that word fail to mean what it said. And I thought, not this time. Not in my recovery room. Not 18 inches from my bed. I did not say any of this to Robert the next morning. I was too tired, too sore, too aware that the first few days needed to be about healing and not about conflict. And I had learned, over 6 years and honestly over a lifetime before that the things you say in the first flush of anger are rarely the things that produce the outcome you actually want. So I said nothing. I focused on my physiotherapy exercises. I focused on the small, humiliating, necessary tasks of early recovery. Learning to stand again. Learning to walk to the bathroom with a frame. Learning to manage pain without becoming dependent on managing it badly. And underneath all of that, in the quiet hours of the long afternoons when Robert was at work and the house was still, I started to think properly, the way I think about things when I have decided they matter. Because this was not, I understood very quickly, simply a problem about a garage. It was the latest and most physically intrusive instance of a pattern that had been running through my marriage for 6 years. A pattern I had noticed, managed, and chosen not to address at full volume, because each individual instance had seemed, on its own, too small to be worth the conflict. The pattern had a shape, and the shape had just arrived in the wall beside my recovery bed in the form of music I hadn't asked for and a returning car at 1:30 in the morning. And I was finally, too tired to keep telling myself it was nothing. But before I tell you what the following 8 weeks looked like, and I will be precise, because precision was the only thing that mattered once I decided to act, I need to take you back. Because what happened in my recovery room did not begin in my recovery room. It began 6 years earlier, in small concessions I had made one at a time, each one reasonable in isolation, each one part of something I had never stepped back far enough to see whole. The garage was not the beginning. The garage was simply the moment the pattern became something I could no longer pretend not to notice, because it was now 18 inches from my pillow. Before I take you back, I want to ask you something. Have you ever been at your most physically vulnerable, recovering from something serious, and discovered that a decision had been made about your home while you couldn't object? Has anyone ever counted, even unconsciously, on the fact that you were too weak or too tired to push back? Tell me in the comments, because what happened over those 8 weeks taught me something about the difference between recovery and surrender. And they are not the same thing, even though from the outside they can look identical. Subscribe. Let me take you back 6 years. My name is Helen. I am 46 years old. I have been married to Robert for 6 years, and together with him for 8. Before Robert, I was married once before. A marriage that ended amicably after 11 years. No children, both of us simply becoming different people at different speeds. And I came into my relationship with Robert as someone who owned her own home outright. That fact matters to this story, and I will come back to it. But I want to introduce it now because it shapes everything that follows. I work as a quantity surveyor, which means my professional life involves measuring things precisely, calculating costs accurately, and producing documents that other people rely on to make significant decisions. I mention this because, like the others in this kind of story I imagine you've heard, the skills I bring to my work are the same skills I eventually brought to my marriage, once I decided they were needed there too.
I do not exaggerate. I do not catastrophize. I measure, I document, and I wait for the moment when the measurement is complete enough to act on. Robert is 52. He is a kind man, genuinely, fundamentally kind, in a way that I want to be honest about, because this story is not about an unkind husband. He is also a man who became a father young, whose first marriage ended when Connor was 8, and who has spent 18 years carrying a particular kind of guilt about that ending. The guilt of a parent who believes, rightly or wrongly, that their child's difficulties trace back to a rupture they caused. That guilt has never fully left him, and Connor, whether consciously or not, has spent a significant portion of his adult life as the beneficiary of it.
Connor is 26. I want to be fair to him, the way I have tried to be fair to everyone in this story. So I will say, he is not malicious. He has never been cruel to me directly. He is, when things are going well, genuinely likable, funny, warm, good with people in social settings. The problem with Connor was never his personality. The problem was that he had spent his entire adult life inside a structure that had never required him to fully experience the consequences of his decisions, because his father's guilt functioned as a permanent buffer between Connor and those consequences. And that buffer had quietly extended over the years to include me and my home. The house Robert and I live in is mine. I want to be precise about this because it is legally and factually precise. I purchased it 9 years ago, 2 years before I met Robert, with the proceeds from my previous marriage's settlement and savings from 15 years of careful work. When Robert and I married, he moved in. We discussed at the time whether to add him to the deed, a conversation that happened early in our marriage, handled by my solicitor, and that concluded with an arrangement that gave Robert certain protections in the event of my death, but did not make him a joint owner during my lifetime. This was not unusual or unkind. It reflected the fact that I had built the asset alone before we met, and Robert had agreed it was sensible. He had agreed at the time easily and without resentment. I want to underline that because it becomes relevant later. Robert knew, has always known, exactly whose house this is. The pattern began in our second year of marriage. Connor, at 22, lost a job and his flat share in the same month. A coincidence of timing that I would later understand was less coincidental than it appeared, since the job loss and the inability to make rent were connected. Robert asked if Connor could stay for a few weeks while he sorted himself out. I said yes. Of course I said yes. He was Robert's son, he was in a genuinely difficult spot, and a few weeks seemed like a reasonable thing to offer. The few weeks became 4 months. Connor occupied the second spare bedroom, not the one I would later use for recovery, the other one, upstairs. And during those 4 months, I learned several things about how Connor operated that I filed away without fully examining. He did not contribute to household costs, despite eventually finding part-time work. He treated the kitchen as communal, in the sense that he used everything in it but contributed nothing to it, in a way that felt different from how a guest behaves, and more like how a resident behaves who has never been asked to consider what residency implies. When he finally moved out, into a flat share that Robert helped him secure, including the deposit, which came from money Robert and I held jointly. I felt a relief that I did not fully express, because expressing it would have meant acknowledging out loud that the previous 4 months had been a strain. And acknowledging that felt, at the time, like making a small thing into a big thing. This happened again, in smaller form, 18 months later. A 6-week stay during a difficult patch with the flat share, resolved with another contribution from our joint savings toward a new arrangement. And again, 2 years after that. A 10-day stay that I genuinely didn't mind, because 10 days is 10 days. Except that during those 10 days, Connor used my study. My study. The room where I did my professional work, the room with my reference library and my drafting equipment, as a place to crash for a bit during the day, when he had nothing else to do. And I came home twice to find him asleep on the daybed I kept in there, for the rare occasions I worked through the night on a deadline.
Each of these incidents on its own was manageable. That was always the problem. Each one was small enough, bounded enough, temporary enough, that raising it as a serious issue would have felt disproportionate, would have made me, in the framing that I now recognize I had absorbed without choosing it, the difficult one. The one who couldn't accommodate family. The one who measured generosity in inches. I did not want to be that person. So I absorbed each instance individually, filed it, and moved on. And the cumulative effect of 6 years of that absorption was a precedent. An unspoken but very real precedent that Connor's needs, when they arose, would be accommodated in my home, by me, without much discussion, because that was simply how things had always gone. What I had not accounted for, what none of us had accounted for, I think, including Robert, was what would happen when one of Connor's temporary arrangements coincided with a period when I was not in a position to participate in the accommodation. When I was, for the first time in 6 years, the one who needed the house to function in a particular way for my own sake, rather than the one managing the house so it could function for everyone else's sake. The surgery had been scheduled for 4 months. Robert had known the date for 4 months. Connor's most recent flat share situation had, according to what I pieced together later, started deteriorating around 2 months before my surgery date. And Robert, knowing his son was likely to need somewhere to go, and knowing his wife was about to be unavailable to weigh in on domestic decisions for a stretch of time, had made a calculation. Not a malicious one. Not even, I think, a fully conscious one, but a calculation nonetheless. That this was a window. A period during which a decision about the garage could be made and settled before I was well enough to have an opinion about it. I did not know any of this with certainty while I lay in the recovery room listening to a wall make sounds it had never made before. I only suspected it, the way you suspect the shape of something you can feel but not yet see. The certainty came later, once I had recovered enough to ask the right questions and had the strength to actually listen to the answers. For now, on that first night, all I had was the sound through the wall and the throb of a newly replaced hip and 6 years of small concessions, arranging themselves, for the first time, into something I could finally see as a single continuous shape. The first 10 days of my recovery were, by necessity, mostly about my own body. I want to acknowledge that honestly because it matters to the timeline. I was not in a position to investigate or confront anything during that period. I was learning to walk again. I was managing pain. I was sleeping in 2-hour increments and counting down the days until my follow-up appointment. Whatever was happening in the garage happened during those 10 days largely without my direct observation. I had only the sounds through the wall, which continued in a fairly consistent pattern. Music most evenings, a returning car most nights between midnight and 2, occasional voices.
On day 11, I was cleared by my physiotherapist to start short, supervised walks around the house using the frame, partly for circulation and partly to begin rebuilding the muscle groups around the new joint. Robert was at work. I made my way, slowly, down the hallway, past the kitchen to the back door, which is the door that leads via a short covered walkway to the garage's side entrance. I had not planned to go into the garage. I was simply walking as instructed, and the back door happened to be along the route, and the garage's side door happened to be propped slightly open, and I happened to be able to see in. What I saw took me a moment to process, because it did not match any model I had of what a garage looks like. The space, which I had last seen 3 weeks before my surgery, containing my mother's china in boxes, a filing cabinet, gardening equipment, and Robert's workbench, had been substantially reorganized. The boxes of china had been stacked, all of them, against the far wall, 3 high, in a configuration that looked precarious and that I would later discover had resulted in one box being crushed under the weight of the others, with 2 of my mother's serving plates cracked inside it. The filing cabinet had been pushed into a corner and was being used, its top surface, as a stand for a television I did not recognize, connected to a games console, with cables running to a wall socket via an extension lead that had been threaded under the garage door in a way that struck me, even in my still medicated state, as a fire safety concern worth noting. The workbench had a sleeping bag on it, not beside it, on it. As though the workbench itself had become a kind of raised bed, with a folded blanket and a pillow arranged on top of Robert's tools, which had been pushed to one end. There was a small electric heater, plugged into the same extension lead as the television, positioned near what I now understood to be Connor's sleeping area. There was a clothes rail, an actual clothes rail, the kind you'd see in a shop, hung with what looked like most of Connor's wardrobe. There was a kettle and a small fridge, the kind used in student accommodation, plugged in near the door, with a shelf of mugs and instant coffee and cereal boxes arranged beside them. My garage had become a bedsit. Not metaphorically, literally. A self-contained, if rudimentary, living space, complete with sleeping arrangements, entertainment, food storage, and heating. Built inside a structure that was attached to my house, that I owned, that contained my mother's belongings, and about which I had not been consulted at any stage of its transformation. I stood at the back door for a long moment, leaning on my frame, looking into the garage, and I felt something settle in me that I can only describe as a kind of cold clarity. Not anger, not yet, but the specific feeling of seeing a thing whole for the first time and understanding immediately and completely its actual size. I did not go in. My balance was not reliable enough yet to navigate around the boxes and cables safely, and some instinct, the same instinct that had kept me quiet on the first night, told me that the moment to address this was not yet, and that addressing it prematurely, from a position of physical weakness, would not produce the outcome I needed. So I made my way back down the hallway, slowly, and I sat down at the kitchen table. And once I had caught my breath, I opened my laptop. I created a document. I titled it, in the plain language I use for professional records, Garage Condition Report. And I began to write down exactly what I had seen, in the same format I would use for a site survey. Location, description, condition, date observed. The crushed box of china, the television on the filing cabinet, the extension lead under the garage door, the sleeping arrangement on the workbench, the heater, the fridge. 11 items on that first survey, each one described factually, without editorial language, the way you describe a defect on a building you are assessing for a client. Over the following 3 weeks, as my mobility improved, as I progressed from the frame to a stick to eventually walking unassisted for short distances, I continued the survey.
Not daily, but regularly, whenever I had a reasonable opportunity to observe without it appearing deliberate. By the end of week 4, the document had grown to 23 entries.
Some of what I recorded was about my belongings. The crushed box of china was not an isolated incident. By week 3, I discovered that the filing cabinet, my filing cabinet, containing 4 years of tax documents, and more importantly, the folder containing the deeds and paperwork related to the house itself, which I kept there for easy access when needed, had been opened. Not ransacked, not obviously disturbed in a way that suggested malice, but opened. Its drawers not quite flush the way I always left them. Papers inside very slightly out of the order I keep them in. When I asked Robert about this, gently, in week 3, he said Connor had been looking for an old photo album and might have looked in a few drawers while he was at it. An old photo album in a filing cabinet containing tax records and property deeds. I recorded this entry with particular care because it was the entry that told me something important, that the boundary between Connor's space and the rest of the house, including documents that are none of his business, had in practice ceased to exist. Some of what I recorded was about the broader pattern continuing to expand. In week 4, a parcel arrived, addressed to Connor at our address from an online retailer. This was not on its own alarming. People will receive parcels at addresses they're staying at temporarily all the time. What was notable was the second parcel, the following week, which was a notification slip. Not a parcel itself, but a card from the Postal Service confirming that a parcel locker account had been registered to our address under Connor's name for ongoing deliveries, with a registration date that placed it squarely within the period of my recovery. A parcel locker account, registered to my house by someone who did not live in my house in any sense I had agreed to, during a period when I could not object. And then there was week 5, and what I heard through the wall on the Tuesday evening that changed everything. I need to pause and ask you something. Have you ever come back to full awareness, physically, mentally, after a period of being unwell or recovering, and discovered that while you were occupied with simply surviving, the structure of your life had been quietly rearranged around you? Have you ever found a document that was none of someone else's business, slightly out of place, and felt the specific chill of realizing a boundary you thought existed had simply dissolved? Tell me in the comments, and subscribe if you haven't, because what I heard through that wall in week 5 is the moment this story actually begins. By the start of week 5, I was walking without the stick, slowly but independently, and I had resumed sleeping in the main bedroom upstairs, a milestone my physiotherapist had cleared the week before, and one I had been looking forward to for the simple reason that the main bedroom does not share a wall with the garage. I want to mention this because it is relevant to what happened. By the time I overheard the conversation I'm about to describe, I was no longer sleeping in the recovery room. I had moved my things back to the spare room downstairs for the daytime. I was using it as a place to rest during the day, since climbing the stairs multiple times remained tiring. But I was sleeping upstairs, which meant that on the Tuesday evening in question, I was in the spare room in the late afternoon, resting, with the door slightly ajar, and Connor was in the garage with a friend, and neither of them knew I was there. I want to be careful here because I know how this can sound, and I want to be accurate. I was not eavesdropping in the sense of seeking out a conversation. I was lying down, resting, with my eyes closed, in a room I was entitled to be in, and a conversation happened to be audible through a wall that had never properly insulated sound, because the garage had never been designed to be a space where conversations needed to be private from the house. The friend's voice was unfamiliar to me. Male, maybe similar age to Connor. They were talking about the friend's own living situation. Something about a landlord, a deposit dispute, the kind of conversation that happens between people in their mid-20s who are navigating the rental market with limited resources and considerable frustration. And then the friend said something like,
You're so lucky, mate. You basically got your own place here.
And Connor said, and I want to give you this as close to verbatim as I can, because I wrote it down within the hour while it was fresh, and I have it exactly as I recorded it. Connor said, "Yeah, it's not bad. Dad's basically said I can stay as long as I need. Helen's not really around much anyway. She's been ill, so it's mostly just me and Dad. I reckon I'll be here a good while. Beats paying rent." Helen's not really around much anyway. She's been ill. I lay very still. My hip ached faintly, the way it still did at the end of long days. I listened to the rest of the conversation. There wasn't much more of substance. They moved on to talking about a video game. And then I heard the friend leave. Footsteps on gravel, a car pulling away, and the garage went quiet, except for the television. I sat up, slowly, the way I had learned to do everything in those weeks, carefully, without sudden movements. And I sat on the edge of the bed in the spare room, the room I had set up for my recovery, the room that had become, instead, the listening post, from which I had assembled a 23-entry survey and was about to add a 24th. And I thought about the sentence I had just heard. Helen's not really around much anyway. She's been ill. It was not cruel, exactly. Connor had not said anything actively unkind about me. But the sentence did something that I think is, in its own way, more significant than cruelty. It erased me from the calculation entirely. In Connor's account of the situation, an account he had no reason to construct carefully, because he believed he was speaking privately, which meant this was likely his genuine, unguarded understanding of things. I was not a person whose home this was, whose opinion mattered, whose presence or absence affected the arrangement in any meaningful way. I was a circumstance, a piece of background information explaining why the arrangement was currently convenient. She's been ill, so it's mostly just me and Dad. I reckon I'll be here a good while. I opened my laptop. I added the entry to the document, verbatim, dated, timed, with the context noted. And then I did something I had not done with any of the previous entries. I created a second document. I titled this one simply, Next Steps. I sat with the laptop on my knees for a long time. The light outside the window was doing the thing it does in early evening at that time of year, going gold and then gray. And I thought about 6 years of small concessions and 24 documented entries, and a sentence that had just told me, more clearly than anything else could have, exactly how this situation was being understood by at least one of the people inside it. I was not around much. I had been ill. And in my absence, my garage had become someone else's flat, my mother's china had been crushed, my filing cabinet had been opened, my address had been registered to a parcel locker account in someone else's name. And the working assumption spoken aloud to a friend, without any sense that it might be controversial, was that this was simply how things were now, and would likely continue to be for a good while. I thought about calling Robert at work in that moment and telling him everything I had heard and seen. I considered it seriously for several minutes, and then I set the idea aside. Not because I wasn't angry. I was, by this point, very precisely and completely angry, in the cold, organized way that anger sometimes arrives when it has had weeks to compile itself. But because I knew, with the same clarity I bring to a professional assessment, that a conversation begun in anger, before I was fully recovered, before I had everything organized, would not produce the result I needed. It would produce a row. Rows are forgotten, or half-remembered, or relitigated. What I needed was not a row. What I needed was a conversation that Robert could not argue his way around, because everything in it would be documented, dated, and true. I closed the laptop. I went to the kitchen and I made myself a cup of tea, and I sat at the table. And when Robert came home an hour later, I asked him, in an entirely ordinary tone, how his day had been. And I did not mention the garage, or the conversation, or any of the 24 entries in the document on my laptop. I had 3 more weeks of recovery ahead of me. I intended to use every day of them. I want to ask you something. Have you ever overheard someone describe your absence, your illness, your weakness, your time away, as the explanation for why something was now convenient for them? Have you ever heard yourself reduced in someone else's account from a person to a circumstance? Tell me in the comments, because that sentence, she's been ill, so it's mostly just me and Dad, was the moment I stopped thinking of this as an inconvenience and started thinking of it as something that needed to be ended properly. Subscribe if you haven't. The next chapter is where I started building the case for real.
The next morning, once Robert had left for work, I called my solicitor, Margaret Ahuja, who had handled the property arrangements when Robert and I married, and who I had not spoken to in nearly 4 years. She remembered the file immediately when I gave her the reference, which told me she kept good records, which was reassuring. I told her everything: the timeline, the garage, the china, the filing cabinet, the parcel locker registration, and the conversation I had overheard the previous evening. I told it in order, factually, the way I had been recording it. Margaret listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she was quiet for a moment.
Helen, she said, I want to start with the most important thing, because I think it will help frame everything else. The house is yours, solely yours. Robert has a registered interest that protects him in certain circumstances, primarily around your death or a future sale, but he does not have, and has never had, any authority to grant occupancy rights to a third party. He couldn't do that even if he wanted to. Connor has no legal claim to be in that garage, none whatsoever, regardless of how long he's been there or what arrangement Robert thinks he's made. I assumed that, I said, but I wanted to hear it confirmed. It's confirmed, Margaret said, but I want to add something, because this is the part that actually matters for what happens next. The fact that Connor has no legal right to be there doesn't mean removing him is simple, especially once someone has been in a space for an extended period and has, as you've described, established something that looks like a residence: utilities, deliveries, personal effects, sleeping arrangements. The longer this continues, the more it starts to look, to an outside observer, like an informal tenancy, even an unlawful one. And unwinding an informal tenancy, even an unlawful one, even when the property is solely yours, can become more complicated than it needs to be if it's not handled correctly from the start. So time matters, I said. Time matters, Margaret confirmed. Not urgently, you're not at a crisis point yet, but every week that passes adds to what would need to be unwound if this became adversarial. I'd recommend addressing it within the next month, properly, in a way that's documented and clear. I told her about the parcel locker registration, and she made a note of it specifically. That's actually quite significant, she said. Registering a third party's address for ongoing deliveries, particularly through a formal postal account, can be used, not by you, but theoretically by Connor if this ever became a dispute, as evidence of an established residence. I'd want that addressed as part of whatever conversation you have. He needs to formally change that registration, and you'll want to confirm, in writing, that it's been done. I asked about the electrical situation, the extension leads, the heaters, the cables under the garage door. Margaret said this was, in some ways, the most straightforwardly useful element of everything I described, because it wasn't a question of feelings or family dynamics at all. It was a building safety issue, full stop. And addressing it didn't require anyone to win an argument about whether Connor should be there.
It simply required acknowledging that the current setup was unsafe and could not continue regardless of any other consideration. "That's actually a very good place to start the conversation," she said. "It's the entry point that's hardest to argue with, because it's not about anyone's feelings. It's about whether the house might catch fire." We talked for nearly 40 minutes. By the end of the call, I had a clear sense of what I needed to do, and more importantly, a clear sense of the order in which I needed to do it. Margaret agreed to draft a short letter, addressed to me but intended to be shown to Robert, summarizing the legal position in plain terms: that the property was solely owned by me, that no occupancy rights existed or could be granted by Robert, and that the current arrangement, if it continued, created both a safety issue and an increasingly complex situation that would be considerably harder to resolve the longer it persisted. She was clear that this letter was not a threat and would not be presented as one.
It was, she said, a way of making the factual position undeniable, so that the conversation can be about what happens next, rather than about whether the position is real. I asked her to send it to me, not to send it anywhere else, and not yet. Over the following 3 weeks, which coincided conveniently with the final phase of my recovery, the phase where I was regaining strength, walking longer distances, gradually returning to something like my normal life, I did 3 things in parallel. The first was that I continued the garage survey. By the end of the 3 weeks, the document had grown from 24 entries to 39. I photographed everything I reasonably could on the occasions I had the garage to myself. The crushed china, with 2 of my mother's plates visible with cracks running through the glaze. The extension leads, both of them, with their full rooting visible, including the point where one ran directly across a section of floor that, if anyone tripped on it in the dark, would represent a genuine injury risk. The parcel locker notification slip, which I had kept rather than passing on to Connor, and which had a clear date on it that placed the registration squarely within my recovery period. The second was that I quietly, without announcement, began using the garage's side door myself, regularly, for entirely legitimate reasons, fetching things from the freezer chest that lived along one wall, which I had always done, which was completely normal, and which now also had the effect of establishing, gently and without confrontation, that the garage was a space I moved through and observed as a matter of course. I did not comment on anything I saw. I simply continued to be present in the space, in a way that I think, looking back, began to subtly recalibrate Connor's sense of how private the space actually was. I noticed, over those 3 weeks, that the clothes rail was tidied more often, that the sleeping bag was folded away during the day rather than left out. Small things, but small things that told me Connor was, on some level, aware that the garage was not as separate from the house as he had been treating it. The third thing, and this was the one that required the most patience, was that I waited for the right moment to have the conversation with Robert, and I used the waiting time to think very carefully about how that conversation needed to go. I did not want it to be a conversation about Connor's character, because that would become a conversation Robert would feel obligated to defend. And defending his son's character was a position Robert could occupy indefinitely, regardless of facts. I did not want it to be a conversation framed around my feelings, because feelings, however valid, are something a person can choose to minimize, especially if minimizing them is more comfortable than the alternative. What I wanted was a conversation that was, as much as possible, simply about facts, arranged in an order that made a particular conclusion unavoidable. I thought about the order carefully. I decided the electrical safety issue had to come first, exactly as Margaret had suggested. Not because it was the most significant thing to me personally, but because it was the thing that required no defense of anyone's character and admitted no reasonable counterargument. A house with 2 extension leads running under an ill-fitting door to power a television, a games console, and 2 electric heaters, one of them positioned near a sleeping area, in a space that also contained several boxes of paper documents and a stack of cardboard boxes, was not safe. That was simply true,
And it would remain true regardless of who Connor was or how long he'd been there or how Robert felt about any of it. Second, I decided, would come the filing cabinet. Not as an accusation, but as a simple statement of fact. My property documents had been accessed by someone who had no business accessing them, and that needed to stop, immediately, regardless of anything else. Third would be the parcel locker registration. Again, framed factually. An external account had been registered to my address without my knowledge and needed to be unregistered.
And only after all of that, after the safety issue, the document access, the address registration, had each been stated as simple, undeniable facts, requiring simple, undeniable remedies, would I move to the actual conversation, which was about the future, about what temporarily was going to mean, concretely, with a date attached to it, about the fact that the house was mine, which Robert had always known, and had simply, over 6 years, stopped fully holding in mind when it came to decisions like this one. I did not plan to mention the overheard conversation. I want to be honest about that, because it might seem like the most emotionally significant piece of evidence I had, and in some ways it was, but I had thought about it carefully and decided that introducing it would shift the conversation onto ground I didn't want it on. It would become about Connor's private remarks, about whether I should have been listening, about hurt feelings on multiple sides. It would give Robert an opportunity to focus on defending his son's words rather than addressing the situation itself. I kept it. I wrote it down, dated and verbatim, and I filed it. But I did not plan to use it unless the conversation went somewhere that required it.
By the end of the 3rd week, I was walking normally, attending my final physiotherapy review, and being told by my surgeon that my recovery had gone better than expected. A sentence that, in the context of everything else happening in my life, struck me as quietly, privately funny. I had recovered, in every sense that mattered. My hip worked. My patience, which had been considerable to begin with, had been used almost entirely. And what remained of it was reserved, deliberately, for one specific evening, which I scheduled, again, deliberately, for a Friday, when Robert would be relaxed after the working week, when Connor, based on 3 weeks of observation, was reliably out on Friday evenings, and when the house, for at least a few hours, would be quiet enough for the conversation to happen properly. I printed everything. The survey, 39 entries with photographs, Margaret's letter, the parcel locker notification. I put it all in a folder. And on the Friday morning, I left the folder on the kitchen table, closed. And I went about my day as though it were any other day. And I waited for the evening. By the end of the 3rd week, I was walking normally, attending my final physiotherapy review, and being told by my surgeon that my recovery had gone better than expected. A sentence that, in the context of everything else happening in my life, struck me as quietly, privately funny. I had recovered, in every sense that mattered. My hip worked. My patience, which had been considerable to begin with, had been used almost entirely, and what remained of it was reserved, deliberately, for one specific evening, which I scheduled, again, deliberately, for a Friday, when Robert would be relaxed after the working week, when Connor, based on 3 weeks of observation, was reliably out on Friday evenings, and when the house, for at least a few hours, would be quiet enough for the conversation to happen properly. I printed everything. The survey, 39 entries with photographs, Margaret's letter, the parcel locker notification. I put it all in a folder, and on the Friday morning, I left the folder on the kitchen table, closed, and I went about my day as though it were any other day, and I waited for the evening.
I want to ask you something. Have you ever had to recover from something, physically, emotionally, in any sense, while simultaneously building the case for a conversation you knew you'd have to have once you were strong enough? Have you ever used the time you needed for yourself to also quietly prepare for the moment you'd need to stand up for yourself? Tell me in the comments, and subscribe if you haven't,
because Friday evening is what this entire story has been building toward, and I want to walk you through every minute of it.
Robert got home a little after 6. Connor's car was gone, exactly as the 3 weeks of observation had told me it would be on a Friday. And the house had the particular quality it has when it's just the two of us, which had become, I realized, a rarer quality than it used to be. I made dinner. We ate. I asked about his week, and he told me about it. And I listened properly, because I wanted the evening to feel, up to this point, completely normal. Not because I was being deceptive, but because I wanted Robert to arrive at the conversation in his ordinary frame of mind, not braced for something. Because bracing for something tends to produce defensiveness before the first sentence is even spoken. After dinner, while Robert was clearing the plates, I brought the folder to the table. "I need to show you some things," I said, "and I need us to talk about the garage. I want to do this properly. So I'd like you to look through everything before we discuss it. Not to argue about it as we go, just to look." Robert sat down. He looked at the folder and then at me, and I saw something in his face that told me he had been waiting, on some level, for this conversation for longer than he might have admitted to himself. 6 years of quiet concessions do not vanish without a trace. Some part of every person who has been on the receiving end of that kind of accumulation knows, eventually, that an accounting is coming. I opened the folder. I started with the electrical survey, the photographs of the extension leads, the routing under the garage door, the heaters, the proximity to the sleeping area, and the stacked boxes. I did not say anything beyond describing what each photograph showed, factually, the way I would describe a defect to a client. This is the lead that runs under the door here. This is the second heater, positioned about 18 inches from where the sleeping bag is kept. This is the gap under the door where both leads pass through. You can see daylight, which means the seal isn't adequate, which is part of why 2 heaters are apparently needed. Robert looked at the photographs for a long time. I watched something happen in his face. Not defensiveness, not yet, but a kind of dawning. The particular expression of someone seeing for the first time something they had walked past many times without truly looking at. "I didn't realize there were 2 heaters, he said quietly. "There are 2 heaters," I said, "and 2 extension leads, both running under a door that doesn't seal, in a space with several boxes of paper. I'm not telling you this to make a point about Connor. I'm telling you this because it's a fire risk, and it needs to stop tonight, regardless of anything else we discuss." He nodded, slowly. "Okay," he said. "Okay, yes, that needs to change." I moved to the next section, the filing cabinet. I had photographed the drawer, the slightly not flush drawer, the papers slightly out of order, and I had also, in the intervening weeks, retrieved the deed folder itself and photographed its current state, which showed that several documents had been removed from their original order and replaced, not maliciously, but carelessly, by someone who did not understand or did not care about the system I maintained. "This is the property deed folder," I said. "It was in this order 3 weeks before my surgery. It is in this order now. Someone went through it. You told me, when I asked, that Connor was looking for a photo album." Robert was quiet. "I'm not asking you to explain Connor's reasoning," I said. "I'm telling you that this folder contains the deed to this house. My house, Robert. The house that is solely in my name, which you have always known. And it was gone through by someone who has no reason to be looking at it, while I was recovering from major surgery and unable to notice. I need that not to happen again. Ever." "It won't," Robert said. His voice had changed slightly. Quieter, more careful. I recognized the change. It was the sound of someone beginning to understand the actual shape of something they had been treating as small. I moved to the parcel locker registration.
I placed the notification slip on the table, the date clearly visible, squarely within my recovery period. Connor's name, our address.
"This needs to be canceled," I said. "Today, if possible. I don't want our address used as a registered delivery point for someone who doesn't live here in any sense I've agreed to." Robert picked up the slip and looked at it for a long moment. "I didn't know about this," he said. And I believed him. This was, I think, genuinely news to him. And I watched him recalibrate slightly, understanding that the scope of what had happened during my recovery was larger than even he had been tracking. "There's more," I said. "And I want to show you because I think you need to see the whole shape of it, not just the pieces." I laid out the rest of the survey. The crushed box of my mother's china, with the photographs of the cracked plates, the clothes rail, the kettle and fridge, the full inventory of what the garage had become. 39 entries, laid out not as accusations, but as a chronology. This is what the space contained on this date. This is what it contained 4 weeks later. This is the trajectory.
Robert looked at the photograph of the crushed china for a long time. I think of everything, that was the one that affected him most. Not because it was the most serious item on the list, but because he had known my mother, had liked her, and understood what those plates meant to me in a way that was immediate and personal rather than abstract. "Helen," he said, "I'm sorry. I knew Connor was staying out there, but I didn't know it had become... I didn't really look at it properly. I think I just didn't want to look at it properly, if I'm honest." "I believe that," I said. "And I want to be clear about something, because I think it matters. I am not angry that Connor needed somewhere to stay. People need help sometimes, and I understand that. And I have understood it for 6 years, every time this has happened before. What I need you to understand is the pattern. This is not the first time. It's the 5th.
And every previous time, I absorbed it because each individual instance seemed too small to make an issue of. This time, I couldn't absorb it because it happened in the one period of my life when I genuinely couldn't manage anything. And what filled that space, while I couldn't manage it, was this." I gestured at the folder. 39 entries. A fire risk. My mother's china. The deed to my house, gone through by someone with no reason to touch it. An external account registered to my address. All of it while I was recovering from surgery, in a room 18 inches from where all of this was happening. Robert was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, very carefully, "What do you need to happen?" I had thought about this question for 3 weeks, and I had a clear answer.
"Tonight, the heaters and the extension leads come out of the garage," I said. "That's not negotiable, and it's not about Connor. It's a safety issue, and it ends tonight. Second, the deed folder and the filing cabinet go somewhere Connor has no access to. I'll handle that myself, but I need you to understand why. Third, the parcel locker registration gets canceled this week, and I want to see confirmation that it's been done. And fourth, and this is the part that matters most, Connor needs a real date. Not as long as he needs. A date with a plan for where he's going next. And I want to be part of that conversation. Because for 6 years, I have been the person who finds out about these arrangements after they've already been decided. And that ends tonight too." Robert nodded slowly. "All of that's fair," he said. "All of it." He paused. I think I've been letting myself not think about how this looked from your side. Because thinking about it properly meant having a harder conversation with Connor than I've ever been willing to have. And it was easier to just not look.
"I know," I said. And I did know.
I had spent 6 years watching exactly that mechanism operate. And I understood, even as I sat there with the folder between us, that what I was asking Robert to do was genuinely difficult for him, in ways that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with 18 years of guilt he had never fully examined. I had some sympathy for that. But sympathy and consequences are not mutually exclusive. And I had spent 6 years allowing sympathy to crowd out consequences. And that too was something that needed to change. "I'll talk to him this weekend," Robert said. "Properly, with a date. And I'll do the parcel locker thing on Monday. Actually, I'll do it now, if I can find out how." He picked up his phone. "Thank you," I said. We sat at the table for a while longer, not really talking, while Robert looked into how to cancel a third-party delivery registration, and I sat with my tea and felt for the first time in 8 weeks something that felt close to the actual end of my recovery. Not the physical end, which had already happened, but the other end, the one that mattered just as much. I have to ask you something. Have you ever had to lay out, piece by piece, everything that happened while you weren't able to protect yourself? Not as an accusation, but simply as a record. And watch someone you love finally see the whole shape of it for the first time? Have you ever watched the moment someone stops looking away? Tell me in the comments. And subscribe if you haven't, because the end of this story isn't the end. What happened over the following year is the part that actually matters most. The heaters and extension leads came out of the garage that same night. Robert did it himself, in the dark, with a torch, while I sat at the kitchen window and watched. And I will admit that there was something quietly satisfying about watching him carry both heaters into the house and put them in the cupboard under the stairs, where household heaters are supposed to live. He talked to Connor that Sunday. I was not in the room. I had decided deliberately that this particular conversation needed to happen between Robert and his son, without me present, because I did not want to be positioned, even unintentionally, as the reason Connor was being asked to leave. The reasons were the reasons. The safety issue, the documents, the registration, and 6 years of a pattern that had finally reached its limit. Robert understood that, and to his credit, he conveyed it that way. Connor moved out 6 weeks later, into a flat share that he found himself. Robert helped with the deposit, which I did not object to, because some things are worth letting go of in service of the larger point, and the larger point had been made. My mother's china, what remained of it, is back in protective storage, in the loft, which I should have put it in years ago and never quite got around to. The 2 cracked plates, I kept anyway. They sit on a shelf in the kitchen now, visible, slightly damaged, and I find that I don't mind looking at them. They remind me of something, though not in a sad way. They remind me that things can be repaired, or at least accounted for, even when they can't be made perfect again. Robert and I started seeing a counselor about 4 months after that Friday evening, not because the marriage was in crisis, but because both of us recognized that 6 years of a particular dynamic don't unwind themselves just because one conversation went well. The counselor asked Robert, in one of our early sessions, a question I have thought about many times since. When you made the decision about the garage, who did you imagine would be affected by it? Robert thought about it for a long time, and then he said, quietly, Connor. Just Connor. I don't think Helen entered into it at all. The counselor said, that's the thing we need to work on. Not whether you love Connor. That's not in question. Whether Helen is part of the calculation, every time, the same way Connor is. Robert has been working on that. It shows, in small ways, every week. Connor and I are, I would say, cordial. He came for Sunday lunch in the spring, the first time since he moved out.
And it was easy in a way that surprised me. He was relaxed, the flat share seems to be working out, and at one point, unprompted, he said something about how he probably should have been a bit more careful with some of your mom's stuff, which was as close to an acknowledgement as I think he's capable of, and I accepted it as such, and we moved on to talking about something else. The garage is a garage again. My mother's china is in the loft. The filing cabinet, with the deed folder, restored to its correct order, is in my study now, under lock, which is a precaution I never thought I'd need in my own home, and which I no longer think of as excessive.
I think often about the 3 weeks between hearing that conversation through the wall and sitting down at the dining table with the folder. They were, in some ways, the hardest 3 weeks. Not physically by then, but in the discipline of waiting, of continuing to be ordinary at dinner, of not saying the thing that was sitting fully formed in my chest every single day. But I have come to believe that those 3 weeks were also the most important 3 weeks, because they were the difference between a conversation that could be argued with and a conversation that couldn't be. Anger, however justified, can always be characterized as overreaction. A folder with 39 dated, photographed entries cannot. If there's one thing I'd want anyone listening to take from this, it's this. Your recovery, whatever you're recovering from, whatever has made you temporarily unable to advocate for yourself, is not a vacuum that other people are entitled to fill however they like.
It is simply a pause, and a pause is not the same as an absence. You are allowed to notice everything that happens during it, even if you can't act on any of it yet. You are allowed to heal and observe at the same time. And when you are strong enough, not before, but not too long after either, you are allowed to lay it all out, calmly, completely, and ask the people you love to finally see the whole shape of what they've been part of. My hip works perfectly now. So does my house. Both took time, and both are mine. 3 questions, and I mean all of them. First, has there been a period in your life, illness, grief, exhaustion, anything, during which you suspect decisions were made about your home or your life that you weren't part of? Second, if you went back and looked closely at that period now, what do you think you'd find? And third, what would it take for you to lay it all out, calmly, the way I did at that table, not as an accusation, but simply as a record? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. If this story gave you something today, recognition or permission, or just the sense that someone else understands what it's like to heal and watch at the same time, please share it with someone who might need it. Subscribe if you haven't. Take care of yourself and take care of your home. I'll see you in the next one.